Good afternoon, everyone here in Oxford and everyone joining us online, whichever time of the day it is for all of you. Thank you very much for joining us for this fifth seminar in our series this term, jointly hosted by IIEP at George Washington University, OPHI here at the University of Oxford, and the Human Development Report Office at the United Nations Development Programme. We're jointly organizing this series to showcase innovations in multidimensional poverty measurement, both academically and also in terms of policy applications, and have been running this series for a number of years now. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from our very own Fanni Kovesdi, who's a research analyst at OPHI, in a joint project with OPHI director Sabina Alkaya. And they're going to present on measuring multidimensional poverty, a global assessment of data availability and data gaps. And we're also extremely privileged to have with us today as a discussant Dean Jolliffe, who is lead economist in the development data group at the World Bank. Also previously a co-director of the 2021 World Development Report on Data for Better Lives, and also part of the Global Poverty and Inequality team and the Living Standards and Measurement Study team at the World Bank. So by all means, an expert on all matters data for development and poverty measurement. So we'll hear from Fanni and Sabina for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then a few discussant remarks from Dean before then opening up for questions both here from the audience in the room in Oxford and everyone joining us online via Zoom. If you have any questions whilst the presentation or the discussion is ongoing, you can just pop them into the Q&A chat box if you're joining on Zoom, or use the raise your hand function, and then we can bring you into the discussion. If you're here in the room, just make yourself known to me, and then we can also take your question. The seminar is being recorded, so anything that you are saying either online or here in the room will then also be on the record. Need to flag that. And then the recording will also later on be uploaded to our YouTube playlist that we have for the seminar series. All right, with that, I will hand over to Fanni and Sabina for presentation. I'll let you know when you're about 25 minutes or so that you know when to wrap up. And yeah, the screen and the camera is yours.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I'll start just a couple minutes and Fanni will give the presentation. The most common question we have when we present the global MPI is, why didn't you include other indicators? And another common question is, why doesn't it cover more countries, particularly advanced economies? And also, why is it perhaps not adequate for many middle and upper middle income countries where MPI rates are very low? And so that question has recurred in the sense since we launched the global MPI, because in 2009, Maria Santos made a test complementary MPI using the EU Silk data sets, but it was decided not to launch that because some of the comparability issues were quite serious at that time. And also some of the subjective indicators were difficult. But the question has never gone away. So this paper basically is trying to scope the possibility of having rigorous comparable data. It's never going to be perfect, but with a kind of comparability that's similar to the global MPI, but that would cover either a wider set of countries or produce not an acute multidimensional poverty measure, but a moderate poverty measure. And this is a bit of a detective story because we didn't know going into this what we would find. And this is the work of a number of people under Fanni, Alexandra Fortage, Dina, OPHI, Rachel Pearson, and a team of people have basically been working on the data sets, on the microdata, pulling out the exact questionnaire wording and response structure to try to solve this puzzle of what exists, what kind of comparability we get for different types of MPI. So over to you, Fanni.
Thank you very much, Sabina, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining online or here in person today. So as Sabina mentioned, today we'll be talking about data. moving on a little bit from previous weeks, talking about the global MPI and looking at what might be possible beyond that. This is the outline today. I will cover a little bit more about what Sabina said about our motivation and the previous studies that have been done on this topic at OPHI. And then I will explain the methodology and the review process and different steps that we've gone through to look at the data. And then show the results. So what are some of the possible additional indicators that we might consider for a measure like the global MPI, and what are some of the additional structures that we could think of going beyond the global MPI. So as Sabina mentioned, and all of you are familiar, hopefully, with the global MPI by now, it's an internationally comparable measure of acute poverty. So it covers over 100 developing countries and over 6.1 billion people, with 3 dimensions and 10 indicators that you can see here on the slide. While the global MPI is very informative, and still provides a lot of information for countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, in some parts of the world, it's becoming less useful. So there are a number of countries. In this year's global MPI, there is 53 that have a headcount ratio of less than 10%. So what this means is that only 1 in every 10 or less people are deprived or multidimensionally poor according to the global MPI indicators and cutoffs. So why is that the case? It's because the global MPI measures deprivations that are quite severe. So, lack of very basic resources, such as clean drinking water or a toilet. So in many of the countries, positively, there has been a lot of progress, and a lot of these deprivations have been eradicated or at least minimized. So you have countries where the global MPI deprivations are just not relevant anymore. And also we have a number of countries where MPI is still quite high. There are inequalities within the country. So we have urban areas like Lagos or Addis Ababa where the MPI is very, very low, while the rest of the country, these deprivations are still quite rife. So then one might ask, when thinking about these low MPI countries or regions, how can we capture poverty in these countries where the global MPI is not very relevant anymore and it's not providing enough information across those 10 indicators? And if we stick with the global MPI structure, what might a less acute form of these deprivations look like? Can we stick with the same 10 indicators, or do we need to go beyond it? Do we need to think of new deprivations that are more relevant to so-called moderate poverty settings, or even thinking of advanced economies, or the case of Europe, North America, where the global MPI is not covering? What does poverty look like in these countries, and how can we capture it in a whole global measure that covers these countries? So a number of options have been put forward in various studies. So by Alkai and Set in 2016, there was the destitution measure, which is basically adjusting the cutoffs of any MPI to have a more severe or a less severe cutoff, and by that capture either a subset or a superset of the poor that is identified by the global MPI. So this has been applied in the destitution measure, and in the moderate MPI paper that we've done a couple of years ago, we've tried to identify the superset, so increasing the deprivation thresholds to capture additional people. Another option is to add additional conditions, so retain the indicators that we have, but for instance in assets, add a couple of new assets into the indicator, or add in not just source of drinking water, but disruption of drinking water, disruption to drinking water supply, or quality of drinking water. So add additional conditions to create new deprivations. Third option is to, again, keep the global MPI structure, but add a new dimension or new indicators. So in a sense, that would change the MPI, but it would still keep the existing three dimensions and 10 indicators. And then a fourth option is to just completely have a new structure that doesn't align with what has been done before. So on the existing work, as Sabina has already mentioned, we have obviously the revision of the global MPI in 2018 that have done a similar data review on the HSM mix and looked at adding additional indicators and dimensions, most importantly employment. However, at the time, this was not feasible. In 2019, OPHI and UNDP Latin America has done a study on 6 Latin American countries trialing what was called a middle income MPI. So this was looking at using national household surveys and harmonizing them to cover a set of deprivations that represent poverty in middle income contexts. So importantly, this added employment as a dimension and also indicators on social protection. So that's access to pension and things like that. But there was a number of data constraints, mostly because the national surveys had very different ways of asking the questions and very different definitions on, especially around social protection. At the similar time, there was a study in OPHI called the Moderate MPI, which has focused on keeping the global MPI structure and doing or trialing the approach that Alka and Seth put out in their paper. So this retained the same data sources, so the HSM mix, and retained the exact global MPI structure of 3 dimensions and 10 indicators. And what we've done here is looked at additional conditions, so whether we can add new conditions onto the existing indicators, or whether we can increase the deprivation cutoffs in a way that is meaningful and creates a superset of global MPI poor. So we trialed this in 6 countries across the world, so 1 from each of the developing regions, and also in a mix of DHSM mixed countries. And what we found is that although in some of the countries, it made quite a big difference, so mostly in low middle income countries, in countries like Serbia, that also had basically 0 poverty by the global MPI, even these new increased threshold didn't lead to any meaningful increase. So the global MPI was still very, very low, which indicated to us that there's quite a large variation across these middle income countries. And although in some of the countries, the new thresholds would, require a very big jump and governments would really need to kind of work hard. In some of the countries like Serbia, those deprivations are already non-existent. So we have this problem of how to account for both ends of the distribution. So our motivation, as Sabina mentioned, was informed by many of these studies already done at OPHI. And one of the key takeaways from all of them was the data constraints. And that's most of the questions we get in working with MPIs. Why we're not including certain indicators, why we're not covering certain countries. And usually the answer is the data. So what we've done with this study and what was our motivation is to do an up-to-date survey of the household survey landscape and to try and see if we would be able to go beyond the global MPI. So why household surveys? Up to this day, most MPIs still rely on household surveys, and it's very likely that that will continue into the future for at least the next decade. And why the current data landscape is problematic. So as I mentioned, the HSM mix updates their surveys on average 4 to 5 years. So while this is not, there are worse examples, 4 to 5 years is quite good, but it doesn't give us annual updates. So we can't have regularity, we can't monitor poverty, on a regular basis. And what this year's global MPI report has found, that actually some of the poorest countries had the oldest surveys. So in, I think, 5 poorest countries, the surveys were more than 10 years old. So that gives us a very out-of-date picture of poverty and, not very relevant if we want to focus on eliminating it. And in the case of national surveys, these tend to be quite regular, so collected annually, biannually. However, this is often done by statistical offices. So the data is collected by the statistical office, it's not released for public access. And also these surveys are tailored to national context. So the indicators and the questions they collect is not necessarily comparable to other countries, even within the region. And in a lot of national surveys, health data is quite limited, especially in more of the advanced economies, where also they have multiple surveys for many different things. So often you have very, very niche surveys, and because MPI requires data from a single survey, that creates a lot of problems. So our goal, as I mentioned, was to assess the feasibility of a global index, and global in the sense that it goes beyond the global MPI, both in terms of country coverage, so looking at not just developing countries, but advanced economies, and go beyond the global MPI in terms of indicator coverage. So most importantly, we wanted to include employment, if possible, while retaining all of the features that are available, such as disaggregation, covering sufficient sample design and size for analysis, and also hopefully frequent updates. So this was kind of the wish list, if you say, that we set out with at the beginning of this data review. So the approach that we had was run on two streams. So on one hand, we were conducting a similar review to 2018, so reviewing the global MPI surveys of the HSM mix and looking at the questionnaires and identifying new questions that have been added or that we previously haven't considered, and also updating the set of countries that we've been looking at. So the new country and the new surveys that have come out. Hi, sorry. Since the 2018 update. And on the second stream, we had the new surveys. So these were mostly national surveys or cross-national surveys and data sets, focusing primarily on advanced economies and the most populous countries. But here, what we were looking is whether it's feasible to get a comparable measure using only national surveys. Well, but basically anything that's not the HSM mix. So the requirements, as I mentioned, was that it should be a single data set with all of the indicators, or a single survey in most cases. It should have individual or household level data, and this is what we need to construct an MPI. It should be nationally representative, and ideally also be able to disaggregate parts of national regions. It should have sufficient sample size for analysis, disaggregation, and it should be regularly collected and include non-monetary modules, because that's what most MPIs include. So kind of the first column shows what's in national MPIs, global MPI, and then the second is more related to well-being, so some of the additional areas that we wanted to cover. So in terms of the review, the three-staged process. So in the first stage, we identified surveys based on web searches, external consultations, also discussions with people in OPHI. The second stage, we have reviewed these surveys on our first level, so according to those criteria that I've just shown. And then the third one, on a very narrow set of surveys, we've done a very detailed review of the questionnaire. So going question by question, listing all of the exact question wordings, recall periods, and also the answer categories, and comparing these across a set of surveys. And the three steps were done for this first stream of national and cross-national new surveys. And then for the HSM mix, only the third step of questionnaire review, because they're already being used, so we didn't have to establish that they were relevant. So a little bit in detail about the exact process. So the first here was this quick review. So here we've done a lot of online searches. So this was looking at microdata libraries, publications that have done similar data reviews, or, international organization, regional bodies that have working across multiple countries and which have some of these resources. And also expert opinions. So talking to people in statistical offices, international organization, some academics who have worked on MPIs in their own countries, having meetings with survey providers, and also building on the existing data that is available in OPHI and the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network. So many countries that already have their own national MPIs, we know that those surveys, to an extent, are suitable to construct, their own national MPIs, but potentially going beyond that as well. So in this first stage of quick searches, we have considered a total of 129 national surveys, 26 cross-national surveys, and 8 harmonized data sets. So this is just a breakdown across the different regions, and some of them are cross-country or cross-region, global in coverage. And in addition to this, we have the 35 plus countries with official national MPIs. And also some of the survey suitability has been established in previous academic studies. So for instance, in the case of the EU, there's been studies in USIL, or in the United States, the American Community Survey, in Germany, the Economic Panel Survey. Some of those we already knew were suitable. But this first stage was really looking at whether the surveys, well, when was the last survey? Is the survey still running? Does it have kind of core non-monetary modules, or is it just looking at income and consumption? So the second stage was a narrowing of these 129 surveys and doing some additional checks. So here we looked in detail at the sample design, the segregations, the frequency of the updates, and also assessing the modules against that list that I'm showing earlier. So here we looked at 10 cross-national surveys, 43 national surveys for the second check. And then based on this, we've selected 25 national surveys and 3 cross-national data sets for further review, which was the questionnaire review. And the additional national MPIs that here Jacob has once already reviewed and listed all the key indicators available across those. Already at this stage, we could see some of the limitations that appeared in the data sets out there. So one of them was the lack of surveys covering, the key MPI modules at the same time. As I mentioned, in a lot of the countries, there were multiple surveys, 5, 6, 7, one looking at housing, one looking at health, one looking at employment, but there wasn't a single survey that combined those information on all of those areas, and the surveys couldn't be linked in most countries either. So we have this kind of surveys operating in silos problem. Second issue is sample sizes. So I'll talk a little bit more about GAP, but it's a survey that covers up to 160 countries and collects some MPI relevant information that could be, possibility for MPI relevant modules. However, it only surveys 1,000 people in every single country. So while that might be suitable for the type of analysis, more commercial analysis, the data is often useful. In our cases, if we're looking to establish a subset of people who are poor, and then disaggregating and looking within, with 1,000 people, that's very likely not, that's just not possible. And also in the case of, countries like India and Russia, they have samples of 2,000–3,000, but that's still very little when you're thinking of, countries with that population size. A third limitation has been the disaggregation. So for instance, in the case of China, the data can be disaggregated, but it's to a quite high level. So when thinking about population, if we're not able to go down to quite low level and we can, let's say, only disaggregate by 3 or 4 regions, it's less informative. And some of the surveys have irregular updates. So in the case of India, it has been updated every 5 years, but it's unclear how that will continue into the future. So the questionnaire review focused on those 28 countries. So mostly advanced economies, and also on some of the most populous countries, because we were looking at population coverage for a global measure. And also there was a little bit of selection based on the accessibility. So some of the countries that were, big population, we couldn't access the surveys either because it was not in a language that any of us or anyone at OPHI could read or speak. Some of the surveys were behind paywalls, and some of them were also limited access by statistical offices. So there was a few countries that we couldn't cover. So there was 28 national surveys for covering 25 countries and about 5.2 billion people, which is 72% of the global population. As I mentioned, we covered the Gallup World Poll, which is cross-national, covering up to 160 countries. And in addition, we had 2 regional harmonized databases. So one is the European Survey on Income and Living Conditions in the EU, which covers all the member states, as well as 10, countries in the economic area and the UK. And CEDLAS is the Latin American harmonized database covering 24 countries in the region. So here we're trying to look at surveys that either are, covering a lot of countries like the Gallup, or are already harmonized, which would reduce it would make sure that a set of indicators is available and is comparable across these countries. So this is just an overview of the surveys that we have covered. And well, so these are the national surveys. So this was a very interesting exercise, but what we found is, looking at national surveys does require a lot of harmonizations, because they all collect the questions in slightly different formats, slightly different recall periods. So even if an MPI is feasible using national surveys, it will be very, very resource intense, even more so than the global MPI, which is at least using, comparable surveys, uniform questions from those cases. And also in some of the countries, the modules not always available, so you would be dealing with missing indicators here and there. So in the case of the cross-national surveys, as I mentioned, we covered these because they provide a lot of coverage in terms of countries, and also reduce the harmonization issue, because the variables are already harmonized, or the surveys, the way they're collected is comparable. And across, if we look at these 3 data sets, it's quite interesting that across all the countries in the world, there's only 65 countries and 67 million people who are not covered by any of these 3 surveys. So only 65 countries don't have any of these surveys in the world. Most of them are very, mini states or small island nations or isolated regimes like North Korea. So that was something quite interesting, but also kind of gave us an idea of the geographic focus on where some of these missing countries are located. So moving on to the results, and first staying with these cross-national databases, what we found is it's very difficult to have an MPI that covers all of these desired dimensions across all of these different data sets. So education seems to be a very solid basis. We've also, Jacob's also found this in the national MPI reviews, education, so that school attendance usually and years of schooling is available in almost all countries. Well, so all of the surveys that we've reviewed, but almost also all national surveys tend to collect information on these questions. The rest of them is less straightforward. So employment actually seems to be quite regularly collected in national surveys and these cross-national databases, but it's not in the DHS in the mix. So, and also the recall periods across surveys tend to differ. So in some countries, it's a 7-day recall period, in some it's the 4-week recall period, and in others, it's a 12-month recall period. So there's a lot of variation. Finances, so there is something on finances in most cases, but it has quite a large variation. So in the case of the EU, it's material deprivation. In the Gallup, it's about living costs. In CEDLAS, it's about assets, and they don't have material deprivation. So again, we're looking at a similar area, but very different questions. Living conditions, actually, it was quite interesting because we thought that the living conditions would be something that's quite widely available in a similar format. But I think only phone access was the one that was available in all 4 of these data sets. And that has a couple of explanations. So one is that the deprivations that are collected in the DHSM mix, so often, water access, sanitation, quality of housing, are not collected in more advanced settings. So in the case of, EU Silk, they don't ask about water source. They don't ask about access to a phone, because it's assumed that most people would have that access. So then we have a little bit of a disjuncture between what is being collected across these two settings. And the most difficult area is health. So I think this wasn't news to us, because in the global MPI, health is often missing in some of the countries, and also the way it's collected, just health data in general is not widely available in these multi-topic household surveys. And what we found here is this is also the case. So there was not a single variable indicator that was in all of the surveys. So in the case of the EU Silk, we had questions on limited activities, so whether a person, is able to climb up the stairs or do shopping without any physical limitations, or whether they had unmet medical or dental needs. In the case of the DHSM mix, we have nutrition, which is in the global MPI, and in some of the countries, health insurance, but we don't have any of these other ones. In the case of Gallup World Poll, we have, again, limited activities and a question on food insecurity. And in the case of settlers, I don't think we have any of them, maybe insurance. Oh yeah, we don't have any of it. So when thinking about health, it's very, very difficult to capture, even just to have it available. And then the next step to think about how we can, create something that's comparable across countries and these data sets. Oh, and one thing to note, I just wanted to mention here is that in the case of settlers, well, health is not available in a harmonized format, so it's not included in the harmonized variables. Some of the underlying data sets do have health or might have health because some of the national MPIs included. It's just that settlers doesn't harmonize this information. So this is just more in detail what I was discussing and showing that, health is very patchy and it's very difficult to get something that's available across all of the countries, or sorry, all of the data sets. So that was the information mostly from the cross-national work that covered quite a number of countries. And then what we try to do is to look at how that could be supplemented, or how that differs from the national surveys and how that differs from the DHSM mix. So what we've seen in a lot of the national surveys, because we focused on advanced economies, as I mentioned, there was a little bit of a disjuncture in the deprivations that were captured. So a lot of the deprivations, such as asset ownership, sanitation, water, access to electricity, that is in the DHSM mix, is just not collected in high-income countries. And these are deprivations that even if they're collected would be very, very low. But the more relevant areas, things like having death or chronic illness, non-communicable disease, or obesity, long-term unemployment, that are more relevant and are collected in surveys, in the EU, in the US, Australia, New Zealand. These are not available in most of the national surveys in middle-income countries. So we have this juncture in what is actually being captured in these surveys. And when we thought about the mix in the DHS and when we analyzed the questionnaires, we decided to apply a similar threshold like the previous study in 2018 by Arkai and Compatability, which defined a basic cutoff of 75 countries and 3.5 million people, I believe. So it required a minimum threshold for inclusion of any indicator in the global MPI to get sufficient country and population coverage. So we tried to do the same and applied a cutoff of 72 countries and 2.6 billion people of the surveys that were reviewed. And what we got was the questions that are highlighted here in bold. So some of them were already considered for the global MPI in 2018, such as overcrowding, but it was decided, or land and livestock, but it was decided for other that not to include them. And if you have questions, I'm sure Sabina can explain a little bit more about this. So it was in a way good and surprising in a good way that, you know, there was a number of variables that were available for that minimum set of countries, but it's still, you know, it's still very limited, especially in terms of health, and not comparable to what we've just seen before, to most of the national and cross-national surveys in more, you know, middle income and high income settings. So what we've done with all of this information is try to think about some very preliminary measures, and I'll explain a little bit. And these are just trials. We were just looking to see if it was possible to create a global measure that went beyond the global MPI in terms of coverage and in terms of, you know, indicators and dimensions. So what we have here is trying to build on the EU Silk and SEDLA's harmonized data set and add to it some of the most populous countries like the US, China, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria. So trying to expand the global coverage to include advanced economies, while also looking at how that would fit with the existing global MPI structure and some of the additional indicators that are in the HSM mix. So what we see here is, as I mentioned, education, and it's available across all of these 4 candidate measures that we created. And so the difference is just very quickly. So the first measure has all of these indicators that we listed. The second one removes housing because this is not available in China and the Latin American harmonized database. The third measure removes health because it was very difficult to get a comparable health indicator, and it would have been just probably a single indicator. And then the fourth measure also removes internet access, which was a little bit, well, in the SEDLA's data set, it's not available, but it could be that, you know, it will be added because it's most definitely in the underlying survey. So those are the differences across the 4 measures. And in terms of the global MPI, those are the indicators you will know that are included. And then in terms of the HSM mix, some of them now also have health insurance. So that's in the mix 6 and the mix 7s that are the new rounds of the surveys. So that's something, and also internet access, which is in the HSM mix, but it's not in the global MPI. So that gives you an idea of how a combined measure potentially could look like and what the population coverage could be. So this is just some of the trials. So we've done, I think, 4 trial measures with ABC sub-options for each of them, just moving around employment and finances and separating them into separate dimensions or combining some with education. But basically what we can see here is that, yes, some sort of measure is possible, but it has a number of compromises in terms of comparability. And also you have missing indicators in a number of countries. So you will run into a lot of problems of, you know, having to reweight, and if in the cases, you know, you have, especially the US, depending on the survey that is used, there can be up to 3 indicators missing. So I'm going quickly because I have only 5 minutes. So these are the additional trial measures that we've done, just focusing on advanced economies. So looking at, you know, Europe, United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and thinking about what could be possible. So what kind of indicators we could add, if, you know, especially thinking about some of these additional ones like arrears, long-term unemployment, health insurance, and food insecurity. Although, and the ones in bold, so school attendance, years of schooling, and food insecurity are available in all of these countries. The food insecurity in the case of the US is only available in one of the surveys, the American Community Survey, not the Housing Survey. And it is basically a question on food assistance or food stamps. So that is, is different. There's already people being targeted by the government who are identified as low income or not having access to sufficient food. So that is different conceptually from food insecurity questions. This is just one of the trial measures that we've done, thinking about some of the cutoffs that could be put in place. And again, one thing to note here is that, well, we can get some comparable indicators. For instance, this health one, in the case of the US and some countries, it would be health insurance. In the case of the EU, it would be unmet need for medical care. So it's not possible to get the exact same question. It will have to be, from each country, what is available. So, that's something to think about, and the comparability around it. And last, just going back to the beginning, so thinking about the moderate MPI. So as I mentioned, we've done a paper on a potential moderate MPI back in 2020. And that was based on the Atkinson report and the dimensions that were put forward as, the ideal structure or the ideal areas for a multidimensional measure. So what we've done here is to try and think whether that measure is possible. So whether we can include work and personal security and also health in addition to nutrition. So this is the existing global MPI structure that you all know. And here is some suggestions on potential new indicators or new conditions that could be added. So we could, for instance, health insurance I mentioned. We also, some of them where the information is not available, to add a new condition. We can think about including stricter cutoff or gendered elements. So, thinking about both women and men having completed schooling. So that would also increase, the deprivation threshold, but in a different way. And in some of the cases, like assets, there is a number of items that could be considered for inclusion. And very quickly, just to conclude, and then there will be more room for discussion. So the original research question was whether a truly global MPI is feasible that expands country coverage and indicates coverage. And what we found that unfortunately, this is still not feasible with the data that we have at the moment. However, it might be possible to create more local measures, whether that's focusing on a set of countries, whether it's high income, low income, middle income, or focusing on regions such as Europe or Latin America, or also thinking about, things like the moderate MPI, or whether it's possible to create like a layered measure similar to, what they've created with the $1.90, identifying additional higher cutoffs. And the data gaps, so we found a number of them. So there has been a lot of improvements in the household survey data landscape over the years, and MICs have included questions on domestic violence and victimization, which is a huge step forward, and health insurance. So this is something that we'll hopefully see extending to a number of countries in the next 5-10 years. But a number of problems remain. That is, number one is the low availability of good health data, and health data that is covered in the same survey as employment and other conditions. Updates, so frequency of surveys. This, in the case of the DHSM mix, they're updated every 5 years, and also some of the national surveys in the case of Nigeria or India, there's less frequent updates. And the sample sizes with the Gallup and also panel data, so sample drop or attrition in panel data is an issue in some of the countries. And just more kind of related to the project, we had issues in accessing the data and finding the data. So creating, there are a number of separate microdata websites. There are organizations that, collate this information for their own work, but there is very difficult to find something across countries, regions, and organizations that collates information in a global repository. And some next steps for future work or questions that remain, may I say that, is first of all, just thinking if such a global measure is feasible. Would this be a meaningful addition? Would this be meaningful given all these limitations that we've seen in the way, you know, the surveys capture certain areas and the different units and modules that are covered? And could we get cutoffs and indicators that are uniform or at least comparable across countries? And just a few more ideas. So if such a survey or such an MPI was to be done, you know, are there new methodologies, you know, such as linked data, or you looking at administrative data or census or alternative sources that could supplement the household surveys that we already have? And whether phone and internet surveys could be a solution, and whether there are any studies on the reliability of these, especially in areas and settings where, you know, phone and internet coverage is not necessarily 100%. And whether an MPI survey, whether that's done, you know, country level, globally, could also be an option. So that's, I think, everything. I think I'm very out of time now. Thank you so much. And Bina and others, please feel free to come in.
Thank you, Fanny. Can we please give a warm round of applause? Thank you so much. That was a huge effort and a very useful resource. And now I finally know what you've all been busy with for a few months. So it's very exciting to see the fruits of your labor. We'll hand over to Dean in just a second. I just wanted to remind everyone, especially online, if you have any questions for Fanny and Sabina, also for Dean in response to his discussion comments, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A box, and then we'll also be able to allow you to directly ask your question later if you'd like to. And here in the room, of course, also just note any questions you might have for Fanny. We'll have time to discuss them after Dean has also enriched the discussion with his remarks. So Dean, please, over to you.
Enriched is a high standard, but thanks very much for the invitation to comment today. It's always a treat for me to read the papers that are coming out of your team and your group. I find the work important in many different ways. But maybe before I comment on the paper, I'd just like to note a couple of maybe broad aspects of the work that on MPI by OPHI and UNDP and your team that I always try to highlight when I give these sort of talks. The first is that the methodological note series that provides the documentation underpinning these assumptions or underpinning the assumptions used in developing the MPI measure. One, it's a great series and it's really important work. The second thing that I try to highlight, and one that's mentioned in this paper, is the transparent and the open access code that I didn't actually check it, but you state that you're releasing it in the paper. And while it's true that the vast majority of your users and the audience that reads the sort of work that I do aren't going to drill down into these technical notes, they are still really critical to establish trust in the measures. And I tend to think this word trust, or I tend to think trust, not the word, but trust itself, is really one of the central challenges we face in this measurement business. And we're going to continue to face it, at least for those of us who want to support the empirically informed policymaking. So trust, it's one of the 3 points that we emphasized in the 2021 World Development Report, Data for Better Lives. And I think it's really links nicely to this paper. I'll add one more comment on this point of trust, and that's just to note that a lot of what your team does incredibly well is the communication of the work program. So seminar series like this, but probably more importantly, the work in countries and the work in the international communities to explain these measures is really about making sure people understand how the measures can and perhaps in some cases cannot be used. And that's really sort of critical to the work that we all do. So I view this paper as part of that process of building trust. It's a thoughtful review of the challenges faced in creating a global MPI that measure a global MPI measure for higher income countries. Having said that, it's also a difficult paper to comment on. I think the intention of the paper is to both document the data challenges faced in constructing such a measure, but also to provide recommendations in overcoming the data challenges. And at least in the version I had to read, that the data recommendations weren't there. But even if they had been there, these are all incredibly difficult questions being posed, and our evidence base to help us answer these is incredibly limited. So with that caveat in mind, I'm not going to drill down on specific recommendations, but I'm going to center my comments around a few issues that I found really useful to think about when I was reading this paper. There's a statement in the paper that says, the construction of a comparable international poverty measure is always a compromise. And I think, one, I completely agree with that comment. It might seem obvious to some of us, but I tend to think it's an incredibly important point for those of us in this measurement practice to really emphasize. I think part of our obligation is to clearly document the magnitude of this compromise. To me, this means building into our programs work that tries to demonstrate the magnitude of the non-comparabilities. So examples from some work I've done is just to look at the differences between self-reports as opposed to observed objective measures, things, and how big of a difference that can make in terms of our measurement of different indices. I think this paper provides several statements about where there are non-comparabilities in the various candidate elements to the MPI. In fact, quite an extensive set of references, but it's lacking the empirical evidence to support this. And I understand that's largely because this is expensive and hard to do. But my concern on this point is that when we communicate to non-technically oriented policymakers, I think they tend to view researchers as being overly concerned about these comparability issues. That we tend to navel gaze too much on what creates non-comparability problems. And I think perhaps sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're not. And our job is to try to provide empirical evidence that can help guide us on which of these non-comparabilities merits the most attention. But I think it's also going to help us to persuade policymakers that, look, these are really important problems that we need to overcome. We need to improve the data quality, and we need to increase the financing to help us do this. And so I think for me, when I talk about sort of trying to build this empirical evidence of the non-comparabilities, it's not to tear down the measures, but it's really trying to build up the support of influential people making decisions on how to target resources to improve data quality. And I think if we can show them the importance of various elements, I think that sort of helps us. Okay. Maybe the next thing I'm going to shift to is this question of how valuable is cross-country comparability. So the paper just sort of starts and assumes that the reader is willing to take for granted that cross-country comparability is valuable. Now, obviously, I agree with that statement that it is valuable, but I think it's important to try to think about what are the types of benefits that we derive from comparability across countries? How can we start to think about this or create some structure or even a framework around how we can assess the value of cross-country comparability? So, for example, it's clear to me that the value of the MPIs, that it's an incredibly powerful piece of information for policymakers in a country, and the ability to drill down to the subnational analysis is really critical with the MPI. It's not clear to me why subnational analysis is critical to the cross-country comparable measure. So I'll be a little bit clearer. My priors are that the cost of bringing in subnational validity into the comparable cross-country moderate MPI that's being described in this paper is higher than the benefits. That's my prior. I don't have evidence to base that on, but that's the belief I sort of walk into it. And I think it would be useful if there's disagreement from this paper that subnational is critical, then I think that case needs to be made. A bit of driving my thinking on this is I tend to think of these cross-country comparisons as being useful for communicating with the international donor community, but I get very nervous when they're used for the input of targeting resources within a country. I tend to think that's much better done with refined measures that focused on the country context. And I think that's precisely the sort of work that OPHI and MPI and the MPI work that they do. They drill down and they create country-specific MPI works. So even to the extent that you might argue that my ability to target within country is affected by how experiments have worked in other countries, usually those comparisons are useful within the regional context. And so it's probably not terribly important for how cross-region comparability to make those sort of decisions. So again, just this summary statement that I'm not sure I buy the idea that subnational breakouts as part of this cross-country moderate MPI is worth the cost, but it would be worth to know or to have some sort of sense of how would you start to evaluate that cost. And I suppose that question underlines that earlier point that it's always worthwhile to at least try to quantify the magnitude of the various costs of the trade-offs that we're talking about. So if it turns out that dropping the criteria doesn't affect country coverage, then you can at least sort of state that in a meaningful way, part of my question doesn't matter because it has no impact on it's not a biting constraint at all. But it would still leave that conceptual part of my comment of what's the purpose of creating the cross-country measure? I think it's worth stating that in a paper like this to try to clearly answer that, because the answer to what that measure should ultimately look like will differ depending on what you think the primary objectives are of this. Maybe the last big point comment, big picture comment I'll make is the assertion in the paper, and it's one that I completely understand, but it's the assertion that essentially the data that we should be using for a particular country should all be coming from one data source. So I think we all understand the motivation for the decision to assert that the data should all come from a single source within a country. It's that point that it's the dependence of the dimensions that's the critical value added of the MPI measure over and above a dashboard approach. My view on this is, again, the reader would benefit from having a little bit more of a framework to think about the cost of this decision. And the angle I'm going here on the framework is just this thinking about it in the context of non-response. So we know that non-response increases with a numerator burden, and a numerator burden is going to be increasing as the number of elements that we try to collect or that we build into a single instrument increases. We also have evidence that non-response tends to be increasing in income. And that's going to be a distinction that's probably of greater concern for the higher income countries that you're targeting with this moderate MPI. So as this non-response becomes a growing concern in all surveys, and particularly pronounced in higher income countries, is the decision to focus on having all inputs from one source the right choice? So if non-response were not an issue, then this is just a question of willingness to finance the expansion of data collection efforts. But money's not the only issue here in this case. And so non-response is going to be a problem. It's typically not random. And so it's typically going to be introducing bias. And in many of the high income countries, potentially fairly substantial bias. So it's a potential trade-off and one that we should be a little bit better informed about and thinking about. So that's a bit of an easy critique on my side because, you know, what's the answer? And here I'll offer sort of a very big picture answer, one that we're very far away from, but it's a point that we tried to bring out in the 2021 WDER, World Development Report on Data, where we try to argue that as we're moving into this world where we're getting more and more data, and we're getting data from many disparate sources, there's just tremendous value in trying to create data systems. So trying to create what we're calling integrated data systems. And by that, we mean sort of trying to improve the ability to overlay different data sources so that you can overlay census data on administrative data, and you can overlay this on survey data in ways that allow you to gather information on multiple dimensions that maintains the dependence that's desirable within the single source survey, becomes at much lower enumerator burden costs. Now, of course, this comes with a lot of concerns about confidentiality and security and safety, and that hits very hard against what I was arguing up front is maybe the most challenging concern facing all of us, which is enhancing trust in data. But I think, to me, that's the critical sort of step forward is how do we think about building better systems in a safe way that fosters trust in the use of data, but also creates sort of greater value and greater return from the data. And I think this report really sort of struck a chord with me on thinking about that, because it's all about the complexity of trying to gather all the different information that's needed for this important socioeconomic attribute that's not captured in a single easy way, that it is a very complex thing. And we do need to think much more hard about some of the data challenges facing us. A couple of miscellaneous comments, I'll just sort of lay them out there. And I won't elaborate on them, but one comment I had was, I would have loved to have seen a little bit more discussion about periodicity in terms of making the comparisons of change over time in this measure. I actually thought that was a relative strength of this moderate MPI, even though the cost was high in terms of the restriction of the number of countries that you could represent. Most of those data files were captured with far greater periodicity than, say, for example, the data files underpinning the global MPI. And that's an important value added, and it's worth sort of highlighting, or to give a little bit of balance in the report. The other measure was, I thought it was a very smart choice to say that we're going to consider a completely different construction for an MPI for higher income countries. Makes complete sense to me. It does pose some interesting issues of how do you think about graduation over time from one to the other. Not things that maybe need to be attacked in this paper, but things that certainly a normal reader will start to think about. And I suppose you'll have to also have to think about, even though you're going to argue that they're non-comparable, people will still infer a bridge across these. And so you'll want to think about how are you going to guide people to interpreting movement across the two sort of structures of global MPI measures that you're offering. Anyway, in short, I think it's really important foundational work. I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I think it's going to help to motivate and justify the decisions being made moving forward. So many thanks for the opportunity to comment today, and I'll over and out.
Thank you so much, Dean. I think that was incredibly useful. Many insightful comments and good suggestions for how to take this project further. I'll allow very brief responses from Sabina and Fanny if they want to, and then we already have a few contributions in the Q&A box and perhaps also a few here. So if there are any direct quick reactions from Fanny and Sabina, please take it away. Otherwise, we can take a few additional questions and comments from the audience. Sabina?
Thank you so much, Dean. I mean, it's very, very helpful to have that feedback. And yeah, we don't know what we missed. I mean, we know we missed clearly. We're collaborating depth. Trying to quantify and magnitude the vulnerabilities. We have the goal of for example, I mean, we have to quantify that. It's true. The vulnerabilities, the differences between how the insurance and but from there. So we'll take that forward. And I think a lot of questions whether it's national compatibility or just really thinking in a way of what we do so you get a perfect kind of question. I think my two questions would be in a sense if there's time with one is, do you see a place where you say there is the fact and cultural by event? We have gone one. And we do this with and in terms of the single data and we thought a while ago that we basically and there's been some change, for example, that we're all in the merged records, the very label.
Ina, sorry, you're breaking a bit at our end. I'm not sure if it's only us, but
is it just us?
I can't really hear you very well.
Okay. I think the last thing was just for Dean, the question about single the integrated data. For example, emerging health record data that we haven't been finding a unit kind of level data being merged with a way to use for everyone. So again, there are conversations in places that we could learn from or articulate amazing benefits that would just be lovely on that. but I really wanted to begin with thank you so much.
Okay, I think we got at least part of that. Thank you, Sabina. Sorry, the connection doesn't seem to be very good, but at least a bit I think we were able to get. Fanni, did you also have any reactions to what Dean was?
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of food for thought in there, and some very good points that made me think about the way we approach this comparability and cross-country issue, and how there are some questions there to be answered.
Okay, great. In that case, we can also bring in some questions from the audience online. So there's one question by Fabio, and then a comment by Bishwa, and one by Subarti. We can take them all together, if that's all right. Fabio's is, how does the trade-off between comparability and variety of information of the existing surveys affect the possibility of effectively reducing multidimensional poverty in the world? One could think that it is also important to contextualize each survey according to the needs of each country, and by harmonizing information or survey questionnaires, and we face the risk of missing the possibility of capturing poverty according to what is contextually relevant for a certain country. Many of the development policies in the last century attempted to normalize the approach to poverty and achieve just moderate achievements in its reduction. So a bit similar to one of Dean's points, I think, in terms of national measures and policy use versus internationally comparable ones. Are you okay with me also reading out the others, Fanni, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Sure. So Bishwa says, thank you so much for a comprehensive review of the existing data sources. It's a formidable task to pull data from various sources to measure the global multidimensional poverty index. To compute the global MPI for international comparison, it seems that it's less likely to go beyond what is being done using the mixed and DHS data at this stage. However, for the near future, it is good to define an improved MPI with a set of dimensions and indicators applicable for all the countries, and then design a national survey and questionnaire, and also estimate the cost required, and then approach UN agencies and international financial institutions, specifically mentioning the World Bank, so Dean and colleagues here, and our development partners, including USAID, to provide funds regularly to conduct the survey in developing countries, and request developed countries to fund themselves. In the long run, we need to develop administrative data for measuring the global MPI. So another quite popular idea at the moment, I think, to move more towards administrative data. So perhaps then you also have something to say on that. And then lastly, Subarti has a question: when can we say that a country is suffering acute poverty? Is there any cutoff value? So I'll let you pick and choose from those as you want.
Leave them off, so
Sure.
get them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the questions online. So on the first one, yeah, I think Dean has touched on that a little bit in his discussion. So we have what we call national MPIs, and what we covered here is more about the global MPI. So a national MPI is something that is tailored specifically to the country context and the national definitions of poverty in that country. And then a global MPI is something that adopts a more universal definition of poverty, and related to the SDGs and some of these basic understanding of what deprivations look like. So there are slightly different purposes for these measures. So while yes, it's important to contextualize, and in a cross-country measure, that detail and contextual detail would to an extent be lost, because we're interested in comparability. So we're reducing the surveys to a set of harmonized variables. That is the point of the cross-country comparability. So we trying to establish, how poverty looks like at a global scale, how it looks like across a region or across countries. But in the national MPIs is where that context is important and is retained. So there is that slight distinction in between the two different measures. But what we're talking about here is just global, so comparability. And the second question, well, it's more of a comment. Yes. So, I mean, I think that's a good observation. And I think that is the conclusion that we have reached as well, that at the moment, if we're thinking about moderate MPI, that will be limited to DHSM mix countries. And it would be, so we already have a paper that was done in 2020 that laid out an initial trial with 6 countries and an initial moderate MPI structure. And based on what we saw here and what we know is coming in the mix and DHS survey, so we know domestic violence questions are coming, or it's included in the new surveys. We know health insurance is now included. So we also have an idea of, in the next 5 or 10 years, when some of these countries update that DHSM mix, we know that something beyond the global MPI will be possible. That's definitely something that I think we're interested in and looking to. And then alternatively, for high income countries, something separate, I think is what the data shows and what conceptually is probably a more better option. And yes, I completely agree about the call for more data, financing, and international organizations to work together in trying to install these systems and increase the frequency, coverage, and all. But yes, many efforts have been made, which is a good start. So hopefully more of that. So what was the last one? When can we say that the country is suffering acute poverty? So in the case of the global MPI, a country has acute poverty, it's a household or a person. So in the case, the global MPI person is identified as poor if they're deprived in at least 1/3 of the weighted indicators. So 33% of those 10, deprivations. So any country that has at least one person who is multidimensionally poor has acute poverty. So I think every country, even in countries where we see MPI is 0.001, there is some level of acute poverty. It's just very, very low. But all of the countries that are in the global MPI have acute poverty. So that's 111 countries this year, I believe. And you can see on the OPHI website for more detail on how it's defined and which countries have acute poverty.
Thank you, Fanny, and thank you, Fabio, Bushwa, and Subati for the questions and comments. I saw that Dean raised his hand. Dean, do you want to come in?
Sure. I hope it's not rude for me. I just wanted to further support what Fanny was saying in the responses, or just sort of my agreement, and I would tack on a couple of additional points. One, there is this challenging issue with, I do think the motivation for the global MPI is very different from the national. Having said that, you will need to worry about the same critique that the Atkinson Commission levied on the consumption-based measure, that the global measure needs to be coherent with the national measure. And that seems like it should be very easy to do, and yet it is a challenge. And so I know that that's already on the agenda with the work that you're doing in the low and middle income countries, but it will be a challenge with the moderate or the high end, with the moderate MPI in the higher income countries, particularly where you'll have sort of richer data sources and sort of competing estimates coming out there. So one, just underlining the need for these things serve different needs, and yet they should in principle having reasonably similar signals. And then on this other point, I just wanted to mention on the comment about sort of building new or going out and sort of figuring out what the minimum data requirements are for the ideal MPI. And I kind of wanted to underline what Fanny was saying about, there are questions coming online now in the new DHS, and I presume also mix on domestic violence. But I think that's the stronger pathway forward, is try to build the evidence base for the value added, the independent value added of these additional dimensions. I tend to think, the comment that you'll always get is, if you're trying to add something in, will be, yeah, that's a different question, but it might already be highly correlated with something that's in there. And I think to some extent, it's incumbent on us to provide the evidence that we're not capturing that important signal and it has meaningful content in it. And so to my eye, I think this notion of trying to better capture physical security would just be an incredible benefit to the measures to make that addition. And I think there'd be an openness to that. I'm always struck by, for a brief while, some time I spent serving on a board of the panel study of income dynamics in the United States, where they knew the to the second the time cost of adding additional questions, and they had parameterized their estimate of the non-response that would create by making that instrument longer. And so the funders of these surveys or the people who are collecting these data are balancing many sort of competing needs and many kind of competing interests. And they're right to be conservative in the willingness to expand things. But I think if we can provide compelling evidence that yes, there's some costs, but there's a tremendous amount of value added in building these new questions, and then there's an openness to that. Sorry, I've gone on a bit too long. Over and out.
Thanks so much, Dino. All very useful, and also great to hear from your rich experience on all these data issues and the problems with collecting the data we want sometimes. In the interest of time, I'll just quickly check if there's any other question here in the room or online. We need to wrap up fairly soon. Yeah, Karian, please.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation, Fanny. During the presentation, you had a table with different modules and the candidate measures and which ones were missing in the different candidate measures. And I noticed that there was a lack of health data that was consistent, or health data was inconsistent. And I was wondering if you had any explanations as to why that was.
Very good question. I'm not sure that I know exactly, well, I don't know if I have a right answer. I mean, I think it's just so like in the case of the EU Silk, for instance, so you would have like some of the cross-national databases, they would be, focusing on indicators that are either relevant for, the framework that they're working in, or, in the case of insurance, it's quite common. So in the case of health insurance, it's quite regularly collected in, the middle income settings, even though health access might be, quite limited, but it's an indicator of access to health. But in the case of the EU, for instance, where there is universal healthcare, that indicator is just not relevant at all. So they're not collecting it, and instead they're collecting, other indicators related to health. So I think the answer is context of a country. So in the case of the US, one of the surveys have health insurance because there it's obviously relevant, but they don't collect anything on chronic health, for instance. Well, they have a health survey which collects all of that information, but that doesn't include anything about health. So there is more health data out there. It's just not in the surveys that capture also other areas. But yes, I think context is what explains variation.
Thank you.
For the questions, I think we are already a bit over time, so we'll wrap up here. Before I let everyone go, I'll quickly also, because Sabina's mic was not functioning very well, as you all noticed earlier, so she's put a few things in the chat. I hope Sabina will forgive me that we probably won't have time to discuss this all, but I'll at least read it out so that those who might want to follow up on some of those questions and comments here can do so. So Sabina, first of all, says thank you to Dean for the comments, and she's taken many notes, and also for the WDR that she's read closely and really enjoyed. Sabina is wondering first if there are conversations ongoing on data merging, and that we had large hopes earlier on, for example, merging health records with privacy controls, but so far no national MPIs have drawn on them. Any suggestions or exercises of strict individual merging that we could learn from, very welcome. And second, there are fora where these data issues on the household surveys for poverty data are being discussed. We simply don't know if this is common knowledge and if there's an ongoing conversation on these topics or not. It is new for us, but probably not for others. Any missing references are also welcome to this. And then finally, we're also wondering if Dean or James or Tasneem or anyone else here on the panel as well, so our co-organizers and co-hosts, had any sense of whether the candidate measures, so the candidate measures that Fanny was discussing earlier, are worth pursuing. we are sort of feeling that the only one with potential real empirical insight would be a moderate MPI with DHS mix, and otherwise it would be better to use only a few national data sets and do an ideal moderate MPI. But any reactions are welcome. So these were Sabina's comments, and I think, Sabina, you sent it to us, so I'm reading it out so that the general audience can also benefit from them. I'm not sure if there are any very quick reactions from anyone, but we're already a few minutes over time, so I also don't want to keep anyone here for too long. If there's appetite for further discussion, please do stay, but we also fully understand that you might have other commitments, both online and in person. So if anyone wants to quickly react, that's very welcome. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Okay, doesn't seem to be the case. Then I hope those who do want to follow up with Sabina on her remarks can do so via email, for example, or during one of our next events. We will reconvene at this very same place here in Oxford next week, and also in the very same Zoom room for those joining online, for a presentation by our HDRO colleagues Yuji Su and Tasnim Mirzna on the Human Development Report 2022. So we'll have a special session with an in-depth presentation on the Human Development Report, Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives Shaping Our Future in a Transforming World. So do please come back for this next week here in person or online. And the recording of this and all previous seminars, as well as the next one, will be online, so you can follow up on anything you might have missed there. Also follow us on social media if you want to learn more about our work, or Dean's and the World Banks, or James and HDRO colleagues in Washington and New York. So with that, thank you for taking the time for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.